You're about to learn the story of the wealthiest black community in American history, a neighborhood so economically powerful that every single dollar spent there circulated through its businesses at least 36 times before it ever left. And then, in the span of just 2 days, it was burned to the ground by a mob of thousands. This is the story of Black Wall Street, and the fact that you probably didn't learn about it in school tells you everything you need to know about how history gets written. Let's go back to the very beginning, because the story of Black Wall Street doesn't start with its destruction. It starts with its creation. And to understand why this community was so remarkable, you need to understand the man who built its foundation. O.W. Gurley was born on Christmas Day, 1867, in Huntsville, Alabama. His parents, John and Rosanna Gurley, were formerly enslaved people. Think about that timeline for a moment. You're looking at a man born just 2 years after the end of the Civil War, raised in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, who educated himself through public schools and sheer determination. He worked as a teacher, then in the Postal Service, and then, in 1893, he did something extraordinary. He traveled to Oklahoma Territory to participate in one of the great land runs, staking a claim in what would become Perry, Oklahoma. In Perry, Gurley rose quickly. He opened and operated a general store for a full decade, building wealth and reputation. But Gurley had his eye on something bigger. By the early 1900s, Tulsa, Oklahoma was booming. Oil had been discovered, and the city was transforming almost overnight into one of the most prosperous places in the American South. Gurley saw opportunity where others saw risk. In 1905, he sold everything in Perry and moved to Tulsa with his wife Emma. And here's where the story really begins. Gurley purchased 40 acres of land on the north side of Tulsa, and he made a decision that would change history. That land was to be sold only to black buyers. In time, this area would become the Greenwood district. Now, you might wonder why Gurley would deliberately create a segregated community, but you have to understand the reality of Oklahoma in the early 1900s. Oklahoma achieved statehood in November of 1907, and one of the very first things the new state did was pass Jim Crow laws. Segregation wasn't a choice for black residents, it was the law. But what Gurley and others like him realized was that this forced separation could become a source of strength. If black dollars couldn't be spent in white establishments, then every single cent would stay within the community. And that's exactly what happened. Gurley didn't just buy land. He opened a rooming house, purchased buildings, and provided loans to help other black people start their own businesses. By 1914, his personal net worth was reported at $150,000, which would be roughly $3 million in today's money. By 1921, that figure had grown to somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million, the equivalent of nearly $14 million today. The son of enslaved people had become one of the wealthiest black men in America. But Gurley wasn't alone. You need to meet the other visionaries who built this community. J.B. Stradford was born into slavery in Kentucky. He became a lawyer and an activist, arriving in Tulsa around 1899 with a philosophy that would define Black Wall Street. Stradford believed that black people had the best chance of economic progress if they pooled their resources. He put that philosophy into practice by building the Stradford Hotel, a 55-room luxury establishment on Greenwood Avenue. It was the largest black-owned hotel in the entire country. At a time when downtown Tulsa hotels served only white guests, the Stradford Hotel offered black travelers the same quality of accommodations. By 1921, Stradford was considered one of the wealthiest African Americans in the country, owning numerous properties throughout the district. Then you had A.J. Smitherman, whose family moved to Indian Territory in the 1890s. Smitherman founded the Tulsa Star, a black newspaper headquartered in Greenwood that became instrumental in establishing the district's socially conscious mindset. Every thriving community needs a voice, and Smitherman gave Greenwood exactly that. Simon Berry created a transportation network that included car rides and a bus line. He even chartered private planes to fly oil barons into Tulsa. You're looking at a black entrepreneur in the early 1900s running an aviation business. John and Lula Williams became some of the wealthiest black people in Tulsa. They owned the Dreamland Theater on Greenwood Avenue, along with a rooming house, a confectionery, commercial rental property, and a garage. And Mabel Little arrived in Tulsa from Boley, Oklahoma in 1913 with just $1.25 in her pocket. She opened a successful hair salon and worked in the beauty business for decades, eventually living to be 104 years old. By 1921, you're looking at a community of roughly 10,000 residents. According to the 1921 City Directory, Greenwood comprised 191 businesses. These weren't just corner shops. You had black-owned banks, restaurants, hotels, grocery stores, and luxury shops. You had 2 newspapers, several churches, and a library branch. The community was so self-sustaining that historians estimate every dollar spent in the Greenwood district circulated within the neighbourhood at least 36 times before it left. To put that in perspective, you'd be hard-pressed to find that kind of economic retention in any community today, regardless of race. This is what Booker T. Washington saw when he visited Greenwood on his way to speak in the all-black town of Boley. So impressed was Washington by the growth and success of the district that he called it the Negro Wall Street of America. During the Civil Rights Movement, that title evolved into the name you know today, Black Wall Street, and then it was all destroyed in 2 days because of an elevator. Here's what happened. On May 30th, 1921, a Monday, a 19-year-old black shoe shiner named Dick Rowland rode the elevator of Tulsa's Drexel building. He was going to use one of the few segregated public restrooms available to black people downtown. The elevator operator was a 17-year-old white woman named Sarah Page. What happened next is still disputed to this day, but Page told police that Rowland grabbed her arm, which made her scream. Rowland fled the building. The next day, Tuesday, May 31st, the Tulsa Tribune, the city's afternoon newspaper, published an inflammatory article about the incident. According to multiple eyewitnesses, the Tribune also published an editorial with a headline that should chill you to your core, "To Lynch Negro Tonight." No complete issue of that day's paper has ever been found. That editorial has been conveniently lost to history. By 7:30 that evening, hundreds of white men had gathered outside the Tulsa County Courthouse, demanding that authorities hand over Dick Rowland. The sheriff refused. Around 9 o'clock, a group of armed black men, many of them World War I veterans, arrived at the courthouse to help protect Rowland from being lynched. This wasn't paranoia. Just the previous year, in August 1920, a white teenager had been lynched by a white mob in Tulsa. The black community knew what "to lynch Negro tonight" meant. Around 10:30, shots were fired, and everything changed. What followed was not a riot, it was a massacre, and you need to understand the scale of what happened here. Through the night of May 31st into the early morning hours of June 1st, a white mob began setting fires along Commercial Archer Street at the southern edge of the Greenwood district. But this was just the beginning. As dawn broke on June 1st, residents of Greenwood were taken by surprise as bullets ripped through the walls of their homes in the pre-dawn hours. And then came the planes. Biplanes appeared in the skies above Greenwood. This was the first aerial bombing of a U.S. city. Survivor Elizabeth Beck recalls watching airplanes dropping bombs onto the roofs of houses, causing them to catch fire. Walter White wrote in the June 29, 1921 issue of The Nation that 8 airplanes were employed to spy on the movements of black residents, and, according to some accounts, were used in bombing the coloured section. Viola Fletcher was 6 years old. A century later, she testified before Congress, "I will never forget the violence of the white mob when we left our home. I still see black men being shot, black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams." A furious mob of thousands of white men surged through black homes, killing, destroying, and looting everything. Some of these men had been armed and officially appointed as deputies by city government officials. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. It was sanctioned violence. As crews from the Tulsa Fire Department arrived to put out fires, they were turned away at gunpoint. Let that sink in. Firefighters trying to save homes and businesses were threatened with death if they did their jobs. White families who employed black servants were confronted by the mob. They were demanded to turn over their employees to be taken to detention centers. Those who refused were attacked and had their own homes vandalized. By noon on June 1st, the Oklahoma National Guard imposed martial law, and the violence finally ended. But the damage was catastrophic. Between 75 and 300 black Americans were killed, though the true number may never be known. The Oklahoma Bureau of Vital Statistics officially recorded only 36 deaths. More than 800 people were hospitalized. Over 1,400 homes and businesses were burned. 35 city blocks were systematically looted and destroyed. More than 190 businesses were gone. 10,000 people were left homeless. The property damage exceeded $1.5 million in 1921 money, equivalent to over $40 million today, with some estimates putting the total destruction at more than $200 million in modern value. And here's a detail that should infuriate you. As many as 6,000 black residents of Tulsa were rounded up and interned, many for several days. Under martial law, the detainees were required to carry identification cards. The victims of the massacre were treated as criminals. But the story doesn't end with destruction, and this is where the resilience of the Greenwood community becomes almost unbelievable. A massive reconstruction of the district was completed in 1922, just 1 year after the massacre, and without any help from the greater Tulsa community. 80 businesses were opened by the end of that year. B.C. Franklin, a lawyer who had moved to Greenwood just months before the massacre, successfully challenged discriminatory ordinances that were specifically designed to prevent Greenwood residents from rebuilding. By 1925, Greenwood hosted the annual conference of Booker T. Washington's National Negro Business League. By 1942, the neighborhood boasted more than 200 black-owned businesses, surpassing its pre-massacre peak. But you should know that this second rise didn't last either. The forces of integration in the 1960s and 70s, combined with urban renewal projects and the aging of Greenwood's pioneers, caused the community to decline. By 1961, 90% of African American income in Tulsa was being spent outside the Greenwood district, and when Interstate 244 was built directly through the neighborhood, it wasn't an accident, as Tulsa's first black mayor, Monroe Nichols, said in 2025. The massacre was hidden from history books, only to be followed by the intentional acts of redlining, a highway built to choke off economic vitality, and the perpetual underinvestment of local, state, and federal governments. The fight for justice has taken more than a century. In 1997, a bipartisan group in the Oklahoma legislature authorized a commission to study the massacre. In 2001, that commission delivered its report recommending reparations. Those recommendations were ignored. In 2020, survivors filed a reparations lawsuit. In June 2024, the Oklahoma Supreme Court dismissed it, ruling that the plaintiffs' grievances, although legitimate, didn't fall within the scope of the state's public nuisance statute. The Department of Justice opened a civil rights investigation in September 2024, but concluded in January that with all perpetrators long dead and statutes of limitations expired decades ago, there were no viable avenues for criminal investigation. And through all of this, the survivors kept fighting. Viola Ford Fletcher, known as Mother Fletcher, testified before Congress at 107 years old. Her brother Hughes Van Ellis, another massacre survivor, died in October 2023 at 102. Fletcher herself passed away on November 24, 2025, at the age of 111, never having received official compensation from the city or state. Today, Lessie Randle, 111 years old, is the only living survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre. But there are signs that the arc of history may finally be bending toward justice, however late. In July 2024, scientists identified the remains of C.L. Daniel, a World War I veteran, making him the first massacre victim identified through the city's years-long graves investigation that has uncovered more than 120 graves since excavations began in 2020. And on June 1st, 2025, more than a century after the massacre, Tulsa's first black mayor announced a $105 million reparations package, the first major initiative to meet the massacre with monetary commitments. $24 million for a housing fund, $60 million for cultural preservation, and $21 million for land acquisition, small business grants, and scholarships. As John W. Rogers, Jr., the great-grandson of J.B. Stradford, put it, Greenwood shows that when we are left to our own devices and don't have a knee to our neck, we can achieve extraordinary things. And as Ike Howard, Viola Fletcher's grandson, said, we don't want history to repeat itself, so we do need to educate people about what happened and try to get people to understand why you need to be made whole, why you need to be repaired. the generational wealth that was lost, the home, all the belongings, everything was lost in one night. What happened to Dick Rowland, the young man whose elevator ride supposedly started all of this? In September 1921, 3 months after the massacre, Rowland had his day in court. Sarah Page, the elevator operator, declined to appear. The district attorney dismissed the case, and according to some accounts, Rowland and Page eventually met up and lived together as husband and wife in Kansas City, Missouri. An entire community was destroyed, hundreds were killed, thousands were left homeless, and the generational wealth of 10,000 people was erased, all over an incident so minor that the supposed victim wouldn't even show up to court. But you already know it was never really about an elevator. It was about a thriving black community that had the audacity to be prosperous. And that's the lesson Black Wall Street teaches you, not just about what was destroyed, but about what was built, about what's possible when a community invests in itself, and about how much work remains to be done to ensure that this history is never forgotten and never repeated.